In this video, we're going to take a look at the thicken option and what are the types of things that you need to watch out for when you try to use this. Now on the screen, we're taking a look at a surface that's essentially an open box. And what we need to do is make a consistent wall thickness on this box. On the corners, we have a 1/4 inch fillet, and on the bottom, we have a 0.2 inch fillet. So what we need to do is make a consistent wall thickness of this box, and we're going to use the thicken feature. So the first thing you need to do is select a surface to thicken. Now in this case, we have multiple different surfaces that are knitted together or actually created from different types of operations. So it's important to note that if you have surfaces that are all knitted together, you'll be selecting them as a single body. If instead they are individual surfaces that haven't been knitted together, you can select one surface at a time. So in this case, we're dealing with a box that actually has some draft. So it's important to note that thicken will go out normal to the surface. So in this case, we have a 5-degree draft. So that means this upper edge is going to be going 5 degrees out. Now, to take a look at some of the things that can go wrong, we're also going to be thickening this inward as well as outward. But let's first take a look at outward. So I'm going to hit OK. And as you can see, we get a nice consistent wall thickness. We can do a section view and take a look at how everything is a nice consistent 1/4 inch thick. Now, the problems that start to arise with things like this is the fact that we are dealing with a drafted part. The geometry in your corners might not be ideal for what you want. So if we look at this from the side, you'll notice that all of our edges are also drafted down. And those filleted edges are actually going down a little bit farther than the straight edges. Let's modify this thicken operation and thicken inward. Now, as I mentioned, the fillets on the outside are 1/4 inch and the ones on the bottom are 0.2. So when you thicken this in a 1/4 inch, this fillet surface that's actually separate from the rest of the surfaces is actually going to disappear. You can see that we now have a sharp corner. So let's hit OK and take a look at what happens. So SOLIDWORKS has removed the fillet. And if we take a look at the section view, you'll notice that we actually have a slightly thinner section on the inside, which can be okay or it can cause problems in certain instances. The portion that actually is a little bit more concerning when you look at this geometry is what happens in these corners. So you can see that the surface geometry is actually bulging up slightly. So the type of geometry that's created is not ideal, especially in this case. If we were to modify this thicken feature and go in a little bit farther, let's say 0.265, these inside corners are now crossing. And once we hit OK, you can see it's unable to thicken the surface. So there are definitely instances where you can run into trouble with this. Now, if you actually needed to create this part and you needed a flat top, then what you'd want to do is possibly fill this, knit them together, and create a solid as we talked about in another video. And then you can use the shell operation. By using the shell operation, we can select the wall thickness, let's say 0.2 inches. We can hit OK. We get a nice consistent wall thickness. And if we look at this from the side, our top edge is now planar. So that means that we have this planar top edge and we still kept all the drafted geometry on the inside. So that's a great workaround if you're dealing with this type of drafted geometry and you want to try to create a consistent wall thickness. Let's take a look at another example. Now in this case, we have a surface that has a lot of curvature to it. And this is where you guys can run into a lot of trouble because unlike the box, which is easy to extrude and shell, you might have a little bit harder time creating a thickened version of this part. Now the parts that we want to make note of and watch out for is actually the edges where the surface actually rolls around the corner. These are going to produce a lot of problems for us. So let's start by selecting thicken and selecting our part. So you'll notice that the geometry actually rolls around the edge and the preview shows that it's actually being created and that's okay. So let's go ahead and say okay and take a look at the resulting surfaces. So as you can see, it was actually able to create that thicken. But if we zoom in and we take a look at some of the surfaces that were created, obviously this type of geometry is not ideal because that edge is actually wrapping around. We're creating some really bad geometry in these corners. If you didn't need these corners, then that might be okay. But in this case, it's definitely not ideal. Let's take a look at what would happen if we actually thickened it inwards. Now you can see in the preview, because of this corner, the surfaces are actually overlapping the original geometry. So once we hit OK, we're actually going to be prompted with an error or warning saying that it cannot be created because certain faces cannot be deleted. Now this means that the curvature in this area is actually too much to create that offset. Now if we go back to our original example of our thickened surface box and we just simply delete some of these features here, let's take a look at what's actually happening with the thicken. So when we're looking at the fillets, as I mentioned in this case, we have a 1/4 inch radius. If we extend this outward from the radius, it doesn't matter because that fillet radius is getting larger and larger. But if we extend it inwards, as we mentioned when we went past that 1/4 inch, it's getting smaller and smaller. Now, this is a simple 2D representation of the curvature. But if we're dealing with something that's very complicated in 3D, such as this surface, you need to keep in mind that if you thicken away from this curvature, then the radius of curvature is getting bigger and bigger. So it's not necessarily a problem. But if you try to thicken inward, then it's actually getting smaller. And there's definitely going to be an area where this isn't going to work. Now, on a part like this, we could do a very small offset, such as 0.05, and you can see it's still overlapping and intersecting. So there's probably not very much you can do with an offset that's as small as 0.01. And you can see even 0.01, this is still failing. So keep in mind when you're creating this type of geometry, something that's very complicated, that you need to pay special attention to the curvature of your part because you don't want to create geometry that can't be replicated. There are several ways around that. You could do things like delete this edge or maybe modify the original sketches that were used to create this. But in most cases, the geometry you create is actually what you need to make. So again, you're going to probably have to go back a few steps in your feature tree and try to figure out what you can change and what you can modify to make these types of features work.